I'm replacing the radiator on a 2006 Jeep Liberty. I'll show what I did to get the old one out and the new one in. There's a few items that could have been handled a little differently, making the process a little smoother if I could do it all again. Shortly after I did this one, the radiator on my other Jeep Liberty started leaking, so I did get to do another. Somehow things just seem to work out, you know. Always work safe and seek help from a qualified person if necessary. Understand the materials and the equipment you're working with. Never crawl under a vehicle supported by a jack. Work safe. It's cooled overnight, so I'll open the drain to remove the old coolant. Antifreeze is toxic, so keep the pets out of the area. A large plastic storage bin is being used as a catch pan. It takes a while for it all to drain out. A large bin is good for changing the oil too. When you unscrew the filter on this particular vehicle, the spillage hits the axle and drips from a couple of different spots, so a bigger pan works a lot better than a little one. While it's draining, I'll pull the coolant reservoir off and try to get some of the staining out of it. I cleaned it with some dishwasher soap and blasted water from a garden hose. It's not like new, but it is easier to see the coolant level now. The grill just snaps off. I'll use some caution as it's a plastic part that's been out in the heat and the cold for well over a decade now. I don't want to overdo it and break anything. For safety, I'll unhook the negative battery terminal. If the terminals are dirty, it's a good time to disconnect both and clean them. The electrical connector for the fan has a locking tab. There's a locking piece in the middle of the red part that is moved sideways, then the red part can be slid open. The connector is squeezed to release it. It's like tying your shoes or folding a bandsaw blade. Kind of hard to explain, but makes sense once you do it. The fan unit clips into the radiator at the bottom and is held in place at the top with 2 bolts. A 10 mil socket on a 1/4 inch drive ratchet is just right to get them out. That's the bolt on the passenger side. There's another one right here. Once the bolts are out at the top, it just pops out. So it snaps in place and then is held with a bolt at the top. Here's what it looks like with the fan out. Snorkel for the air filter's in the way, so we'll just get it out of the way. The snorkel on the air box is in the way, so that comes off next. The manual talks about drilling out some rivets. I think it's these in the middle. I wouldn't do that. There's some bolts that come out here, in here on the passenger side, driver's side, here, here, and then in the middle down here there's a couple more. And this guy up here by the latch. all 10 mil. And you end up with these and 2 empty holes. And there's the 2 bolts that came out. The yellow bottle lid is riveted on so it stays attached to the upper radiator support and slides off over the neck of the washer fluid bottle. Note where the latch release cable is routed so it can be put back in the same position. The latch release cable is still attached, so the whole unit is placed up out of the way. The transcooler and condenser are held on with 4 bolts. They also slide into hooks molded into the radiator end tanks. 2 bolts on the driver's side, 2 bolts on the passenger side. This is the transmission cooler and the air conditioning condenser. And the bolts are out. Two of these, still 10 mil. This is the lower one on the passenger side. The rubber flap is pulled down to reach the bolts in the tank ears that hold the radiator to the header. This is the driver's side. It's a long bolt that goes through the rubber grommet in the ear, then into the header. That chalky material on the driver's side is where the radiator had been leaking. On the passenger side, I popped the top pin out to gain access to the radiator bolt. If I did it again, I'd detach them all. Wrestling with the rubber flap was the most difficult part of the job. The rubber flap has square holes that key into hooks on the radiator. Unhooking both flaps completely right away would have saved time, aggravation, and a few band-aids. I'm using a vice grip to release the clamp to disconnect the radiator hoses. The ears on the radiator hose clamp need to be away from the fan shroud, else they will interfere with the fan shroud. More on that later. Off comes the lower radiator hose. The tranny cooler needs to be freed from its tabs on the driver's side and on the passenger side. The condenser is also held by a tab on the plastic radiator tank. There you see it. The rubber flap is keyed around the molded in pieces on the radiator tank. So here it is out. I ended up pulling these other two pins out so this whole rubber would be released. That's what was holding it in at the end, and then it comes right out. Here's the old radiator and the new radiator. The red plugs on the replacement radiator are fittings for a built-in transcooler. They aren't used in this application since I have a separate transmission cooler. The rubber grommets on the ears, bottom rubber supports, and the extra protective piece where the transcooler lines go are removed and reused on the new radiator. Don't forget the 6 square nuts. The new radiator came with them, and they would be a lot easier to install before putting the radiator in the Jeep. There's a flat on the lower rubber supports, so they only go on one way. This piece prevents the transmission cooler lines from rubbing on the bottom of the radiator. This is a view from standing on the alternator. This is the driver's side mounting, and this is the passenger side. The 2 rubber mounting pieces go into the holes in the header. The new radiator drops right into place. Well, that was a lot more fun than taking it out. Here you can see the piece that prevents the transmission cooler lines from rubbing on the radiator. That's the passenger side. That's the driver's side. This is the passenger side ear. This is the bolt in the ear on the driver's side. The flap on the driver's side is keyed at the bottom and at the top where the condenser and the transcooler hook in and where the bolt goes at the top. Here you can see how the flap sits on the square pieces in the radiator tank. Here's a piece of tape for a shoehorn. We'll see if that helps any. That's what it looks like after a certain amount of finagling. And the condenser can go back in its place. And over on the driver's side too. So now the bolt at the top will line up. Now I know what that package of nuts is for. They should have been put in first. It just snaps in. There. Would be a whole lot better snapping if it was done before the radiator went in though. Okay, the nuts are all in place and there's 6 of them. Suffice it to say it would be simpler to put them in before putting in the radiator. Shortly after I finished this project, the radiator on my other Jeep Liberty started leaking. I got a replacement from the same supplier, same part number, but it came with the mounting nuts already installed. The top bolt on the passenger side holding the condenser on. And into the freshly installed nut on the driver's side. Ta-da! This is the tranny cooler, driver's side. Tranny cooler on the passenger side. With that, all 4 bolts are snugged up. There are 4 on the condenser and tranny cooler, and also 2 on the ears. It's easy to reach the clamp from this angle, but it will be in the way of the fan shroud. Both the top and bottom hose clamps will be repositioned later. They need to face away from the fan shroud. And the top hoses are reattached too. I'm being careful to get the hood release cable back in the same spot and not damage it. Witness marks like spots where the paint is rubbed off will help confirm that it's right. Driver's side. There's that hood release cable. I'll want to make sure that's back in place and the hood release is working properly. The grill mounting tab goes on top of the support bracket. And two more at the bottom of the support here. And now the bolts are all snugged up, working from the center out. The fan's going in next. It's not going to go in the first time because the lower clamp isn't positioned correctly yet. It needs to point out so it clears the fan shroud. That clamp is in the way where it's at right now. It's easy to reach from up here, but it needs to be moved. It would be easier to put the fan in before the upper radiator support. And I got to make use of that handy dandy bit of info after I noticed my other Jeep was parked above a puddle of coolant. The fan is held in by two clips at the bottom and two bolts at the top. And then they get snugged down. The electrical connection is plugged in and secured with the lock. The grill is cleaned up nice and shiny and the soft trim piece on the outside edge glued back on. Then it's snapped back on into place. It's a snap. And the snorkel is snapped into place. Plastic snap together cars. I'm using AMSOIL's low toxicity antifreeze and engine coolant and distilled water. Propylene Glycol Antifreeze and coolant is biodegradable and its low toxicity limits poisoning risk. After filling, I'll check for leaks and monitor the level for a while as it will drop a little as the air works out of the system while driving. I'll also make sure the fan kicks in. I'm using test strips to check the freeze protection level and the pH. They're dipped in a sample, then read based on the color. I'll leave links down in the description for the antifreeze and the test strips if you want to check them out. The old used coolant goes back into containers and then taken to the recycler. Any spills are cleaned up with some floor dry. For more information on purchasing AMSOIL products or to download the latest catalog, check out the links in the description to the video or go to MidwestSynthetic.com. If you liked the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.